Hi, didn't see you there.
Get up, Matt. Come on. It's time to go.
Wake up. Hello and welcome to our roundtable discussion, God Ethics. Cheers. In this podcast, we will each be leading a short segment discussing our proposed approaches to various ethical dilemmas, then facilitate a discussion with some questions. To start, we've got Connor Nickel, data scientist.
Excellent. So my first dilemma here is a Twitter feed that I saw on Apple collecting our data. So basically, I mean, you obviously know that like if you're on Google, you know they're going to collect what you're looking at, but Apple's actually been collecting App Store data. And so this is kind of a surprise because, you know, Apple's whole thing is privacy. You'll see their commercials, stuff like that. But they're actually collecting your App Store data. Like, what do you look at? What are you downloading? How long are you looking at it for? And they take that data and they'll say group you into like buckets almost, where like they'll take people who look at like sports and fitness apps, or like, you know, say other types of apps like cooking or who knows, you know, games, stuff like that. And they'll take that and they'll sell that information to advertisers who, like, say I'm a fitness company, I want to spend some money on advertisements for people who would actually use my product. Then Apple's going to say, we have a group of people we'll target that ad to, and they'll sell that. And you only see that on like the App Store, like news, I think, maybe stocks, stuff like that. Only a couple apps, but it's something that people don't know that they're collecting almost. And so basically, kind of what we want to talk about is, you know, you can opt out of these personalized ads and they'll just give you other ads, but is that like good enough? Like, should they be collecting this data, or should they not be collecting this at all? And I know for me, like personally, I think it's almost like a price you pay for having these devices. Like, I know Apple, like, you know, having the data is not ideal, but them just having it and not, say, giving it away to people like other companies would do with it is certainly better, but like, is that good enough?
So, okay, clarification. What you're saying is that they will collect your data no matter what, but it's whether they use it or not. That's kind of what you consent to?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a difference between them selling it to a third party who's going to use our data.
Right. They're not going to sell the actual data. They'll just sell like their right to use it, basically.
Right. And so you're saying that in this situation, that's not what's happening. They're using the data.
Yes.
They're monetizing.
Right. They're monetizing themselves. But it's like almost not as bad as another company would do.
Mm-hmm.
But it's still like beyond what you would either know or probably think should be happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I would say they're not being very transparent in this case.
I would agree with that,
because I think that should be made better known to the people that use Apple products, that your data is being recorded. It's just whether or not it's used.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
I think that's a big issue here.
Especially if it sounds like Apple's going to use it regardless. And
they're going to have it, right?
And so would we be able to opt out of them using it on their stocks apps, for
Yes,
example?
that's what you can do. So in your settings, there's like an opt out of like personalized ads. And they'll still serve you ads. It'll just be, they won't group you in those buckets that they're like then selling to advertisers. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I agree it's not transparent. I guess I don't really have a big problem with it like on the face, but maybe it should be an opt-in framework rather than opt-out. Because if you don't know this is happening, which like they have every incentive to make it, you know, to kind of hide this from you and make it like unclear that it's happening or obfuscate it, like you can't opt out if you don't know about it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe like a proactive, like you have to actively opt in to it would be good. Although that's not something that any company that's interested in, you know, making a profit would ever voluntarily do for the most part. And I'm not sure what like regulation would look like to that effect. So it's.
And I think a lot of people are upset about this because, you know, they've had their whole like ask app not to track thing, where they basically almost like forced other apps on their devices to not collect this data, but then they're collecting it themselves, and that's why people are so upset about it. But either way, I think, you know, time wise, let's move on to my second one.
Sounds good.
So the second one is a New York Times article on sports betting that I read about recently, and it really targets FanDuel and BetMGM a lot. And it's interesting because I went to a FanDuel talk by the CEO of FanDuel here at UVA, and he really talked extensively about how much they were hiring data scientists and how much their department's grown. And they almost have like 6 or 7 individual data science departments that each work on different modeling And so they'll have like a modeling department who sets the line for the games. They'll have a department who would get TV ads, a department who would do like personalized promotions for people in the app. There's another line that's like monitors like how much people are betting and like says like gives out here's like a gambling addiction specialist like you should go talk to, or like cuts people off, stuff like that. And basically the big problem with sports betting is that it was just legalized in 2018. The article talks a lot about how there's no regulation because each individual state sets the laws for the gambling in their state. And so the problem is like half the states have legalized it, but then you have like 25 different sets of rules that it makes it hard for not only you to know if the company is doing something illegal, like say if you were a regulator, but then also the company has to figure out all the laws for the state and try to figure out how to stay within those lines. And then also if you're like a person in a state as a bettor, you're not going to really know what the law is either. And a big problem that came up for FanDuel, or I think it was MGM, was they had a rule in some states is that you cannot accept bets from credit cards. And they basically accepted 200,000 in credit card bets and basically were imposed a fine for doing this because it was illegal. Like those were bets they could not have taken. So I'm kind of curious what you guys think that punishment would have been if you accepted 200,000 in illegal bets. Like what is your fine going to be if you knew about them being illegal and that they were coming from credit cards and you accepted it anyway?
Well,
just throw some numbers
the
out.
fine is definitely going to match whatever they made, probably exceed that.
That's what I thought initially.
That's what I was thinking. 200,000, I would hope.
And I feel like they're going to do that flat number and then also try to account for like whatever
for them like
tax
having
loss.
intent basically to get around
Right,
it. Yeah.
Whatever tax loss was in that state, I guess, is that how it
Yes,
works?
and that's actually something that we were talking about earlier that is a good point to bring up, Matt. You weren't here for that. But the states have a vested interest in increasing the amount of bet in their states because they collect taxes on the money bet.
Yeah.
So basically these states not only have no regulation but set the rules in a state where they're incentivized to have more people bet.
Right. That's like how Nevada, for example, funds a lot of their state government is through like betting taxes.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say.
So you're saying like probably
maybe let's go with 500,000.
500,000. Yeah.
Or you just want to?
Yeah, I want to give
dollar
me
amount?
a dollar amount. What do
For
you think?
knowingly taking $200,000 in credit card bets.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I'll try and make this really short, but like, first of all, betting on a credit card, terrible idea. Allowing people to bet on a credit card also seems.
That's
like
why majority of
terrible
states
idea.
do have it outlawed, but some do not.
Yeah, I think that's like deeply immoral. So if I was in charge of, if I was the king, and I was making
Of Nevada.
well, if I was the king of Nevada, I'd be in trouble from the king of, I don't know who's fining them, the SEC or something.
I don't actually know who it was. I think it was the state. The state that like wrote the rules saying you can't have credit card bets. Was the one fining them.
I'd make it pretty big because that's like an example of something that I think is, like allowing people to put bets on credit like that could be extremely harmful to the average person. So I think that's something that is like deeply unethical. And I can't give you a dollar amount. I would say it's probably going to be in the millions of dollars if I had to guess. Like, I think that's what it will
that's
be.
just millions.
Yeah.
Eve's is 500. Rachel.
In between,
All right.
somewhere.
It was actually $60,000.
That's it?
I couldn't believe it when I read it. I was like, you didn't even find them the amount that they took in, so they just made a profit on it.
What?
That doesn't disincentivize.
No.
A fine in general is just a tax on
Oh my
illegal
God.
activity.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
I'm disappointed.
It's $60,000. Okay, so that was my first question.
That's a good
cool.
question.
Good
Yeah.
question. Good.
So, I mean, we kind of talked a little bit, like, it's like, how are we going to regulate this industry? Like, obviously, like, having uniform rules across all the states would be ideal. But the problem is, like, you'd have to have the federal government set that. But then, I don't know, constitutionally, like, can you even do that? So that's the problem here. And, and that would make it easier for not only bettors, but, like, FanDuel, anybody regulating it. Like, does anybody have any thoughts about, like, what your ideal scenario is? Like, how would we regulate this industry?
It kind of ties into the whole, like, how do we regulate data collection techniques and how do we, like, have a universal way of doing ethical data science? And I don't know if there's a good answer, especially right now with it being new, but what do you guys think?
Yeah, I also struggle to see, like, a good solution to the problem. But we can't, I don't know. I feel like sometimes in these situations we sort of ignore the fact that every state's going to be different when we give the power to the states to decide. But we are also aware that large companies are going to be in every state. And so I don't know the answer. But I feel like that's a key piece that when legislators make laws at the federal level, they need to be aware of the fact that these companies are not these companies are going to be in each state, and they're going to be figuring out ways to make the most profit in each state. And so,
Totally.
yeah.
I have another crazy example from the article. So basically, FanDuel last year on a Lakers Pistons game set a free bet, like a sign up incentive, which you bet on whether or not you think the Pistons would lose by less than 159 points. So the biggest margin of defeat in the NBA was like half that, like 75 or something like that.
Okay.
And so basically, FanDuel took a $2 million loss on that bet, obviously, because everybody won.
Mm-hmm.
But then they signed up 47,000 new users for an average cost of $45 a user.
Oh my god.
So they were fine with that. So my question is ethically, I think we all probably would agree that using modeling and data scientists to say set lines on a game is fine. If you're a company, you want to make the most accurate lines possible so you can make a profit. But using data science to come up with promotions like that to draw in as many users as possible into
an unhealthy addiction.
Exactly. How do we feel about that? Because I feel that's almost crossing the line.
It happens. I know it happens, and that it just is gonna, because that's what profits, that's where it's coming from. But I feel like in this situation, it would be more ethical for these betting companies to use data science, like you said, to set the lines and stuff, but maybe try to stay out of the personalized ads region that is gonna keep people hooked in that way. It's okay, people are gonna get hooked on their own, then that's kind of a them problem. You're just setting lines. And then advertising, because that's also how you're going to make a profit, but don't necessarily target people with that.
Mm-hmm.
That's where it's almost on the edge, because you, by running that company, know what's happening, but you're okay with it. And you're you can kind of accept it's not my fault, but you're still responsible for it in a way.
Yeah.
So that's already why it's edgy. But I think everybody would agree that it's still ethically fine to set the lines. But I know personally, I don't think I could do that, make models that draw with more and more people into betting, basically.
Yeah.
It's an odd space to be in, because I think of a different industry that's definitely harmful to people, which is tobacco. That just more and more regulation got piled on top of it. So now every pack of cigarettes has warnings about your health and what it will do to you if you buy it.
Yeah.
Gambling is not, you can gamble a tiny bit and be fine. You really can. You can't smoke a tiny bit, and smoking always hurts, which is why I think it was possible to do that to the smoking industry. But this is more of a gray area, which is why I agree it's edgy, because on the one hand, drawing more and more people in, you could find ways to justify it and say, oh well, but if they choose to gamble more and more, that's
the same thing. It's just I'm just getting more people involved, but it still doesn't mean that they're going to get hooked. That's not on me.
Right. On the other hand, you could say, well, I know gambling to be addictive, so our product should come with a warning.
You can almost look at it numbers-wise, too, and be if I draw in a certain number of users, a certain percentage of those people are always going to be the people who get hooked. And so if I'm drawing in more and more and more people, even if I'm not responsible for it, I'm still making it so more and more people get an experience with that, with that unhealthy addiction.
Yeah.
But, so here's my perspective, which is, I guess, quite different from yours. Drawing, using data or whatever to draw people in is also called just regular advertising, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Rachel, I do enjoy a good cigarette
once
in a while.
Good for you.
And I think there are a number of industries that you could argue are harmful in some way. You could make that argument about almost anything. You could say, what about, you mentioned tobacco. What about alcohol? What about...
They've tried to regulate alcohol and failed.
No, I'm not talking about regulation. I'm talking about, the, ethicality, is that a word? Of, drawing people in. So advertising, as it's also known. Using data to draw in new customers, but you could argue that for alcohol, you could argue that for almost anything. You could argue that for fast cars, because those are dangerous too. You could argue that for basically anything. I think if you're going to go down the rabbit hole of some people could get hooked on this, so therefore it's unethical to even advertise it. I just am unsure where that ends, because it won't end with gambling is bad. So.
Yeah, I don't think it's unethical to advertise it, but I think we're just saying using
Like a promotion.
basically a more effective advertising method. Like,
well, why wouldn't you want to make your advertising?
no, I say as a company you would want to do that, but like it's skirting the ethical boundaries.
I don't.
Yeah.
I guess I don't see it that way, but I respect your differing opinions.
Thank you.
Well, great. And that's our time.
Good job, everybody.
Thanks, Connor.
Yeah.
Next up, we've got Eve Schoenrock, data scientist.
Thank you, Rachel, for that kind introduction. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two topics that are kind of related here. The first one is about some offensive cyber operations that the military has undertaken, and I found it really relevant to like where my career is going to be headed, since like I'm going in the military and going to continue working in that industry, and especially as a data scientist in that career field, because oftentimes like the things we have can be targeted. Our data can be targeted and then used against us, and that's incredibly harmful to the entire like American population and any population where that happens. So I'm going to give you this anecdote. Basically, what happened was Iran was frustrated with the United States drawing out of the multilateral nuclear agreement that reimposed sanctions that came from the Trump administration. And the Iranian Revolutionary Guard attached some limpet mines, which are like mines that you can attach to your body and then swim underneath. And they put these mines on the bottom of Norwegian and Japanese tankers in the Gulf of Oman. So the U.S. had a vested interest in this because they're allied with Norway and Japan. And so the U.S. threatened, saying that if this continues and if Iran takes action against the United States in any way, then they're going to respond, and they're going to respond with kinetic means. And so the U.S. kind of went about it, and then the next thing that happened was that Iran shot down a drone that was in their airspace, but it was kind of known that these drones were flying around, so it was seen as like an offensive attack on Iran's end against the United States. And so, again, like I said, the U.S. intended a kinetic response, but when the government found out that about 150 civilians were going to die from the planned response, they switched course and moved to offensive cyber operations to try to limit the damage done there. And so they used these offensive cyber operations to create denial effects, which included degradation, disruption, and destruction. In particular, this one focused on degradation and disruption, which is not going to like totally shut off access forever to whatever you're targeting, but it shuts off access for a set period of time. And so in this case, the U.S. targeted a database used by Iranian spies that target and track ships passing through nearby waters. And it was probably these same like tracking databases that showed where the Norwegian and Japanese boats were at the time they were like bombed. And they also targeted control centers for Iranian rocket and missile systems. And they basically shut these down for a certain period of time. And so the question here is, like, do we think the United States acted ethically? And then it also begs the question and the concern in our minds of securing our databases and how important privacy is, and how we need to really understand the kind of data we're working with, because if we're working with really sensitive data that could have a huge impact like this, or even an impact on like society in general, then we should be like more careful in how we handle that data. So I'll just go first, but I think the U.S. acted ethically because they had a good intent going into the response, especially from like a utilitarian perspective. They were intending to reduce like casualties, which I think is always valuable, especially when it's civilian casualties, like highly concerning. So they were more so focusing on the source of the issue, which is also interesting because they targeted the database that was the root cause of where Iranian violence started. So that was interesting. And so like intention is one reason why I think it was ethical. And then I also think they acted ethically because they remained accountable for their actions. It wasn't like the U.S. was trying to skirt responsibility for this. They accepted responsibility and they were like, yeah, we did this. And what are you going to do about it, kind of, is how it went. But I think that's an admirable quality that the United States had in this instance. And then, because I was able to find this article talking about the situation, the U.S. made it clear to the public their intentions with the situation. So they were very transparent. which I think helps to destroy thoughts that like, oh, the U.S. did this unprompted and like it wasn't warranted and all this stuff. And so I think they covered their bases there, which is really good. But I want to ask what you guys think. Do you think the U.S. acted ethically in this instance?
So did they actually blow up these ships, or did they just threaten to blow them up by putting mines on them? They're like, oh, if you don't leave, like, we're gonna blow it up.
That's a good question. I don't actually know the answer to that, but I feel like attaching a bomb and doing a threat in
Oh,
that way is
yeah,
horrible
no,
either way.
Either way,
I
it's
should
really
look
bad.
that up, though.
The question is, like, did they actually have any casualties or monetary loss, or is it just like, don't come in here, we're gonna...
Did you check?
Well, they were attacked. The ships were attacked, and I mean, Iran regularly...
Does that?
Well, they weren't sunk. It takes a lot to sink it.
Okay. But it was active violence.
It was an act of violence against like civilian infrastructure.
Yeah,
these are
right.
oil
Okay.
tankers. And through that strait, something like a third of the world's oil passes through.
Well, it's a huge threat just to like shipping around the world,
Mhm.
regardless
That's
of
a
whether or
good
not they
point.
blew it up. So,
Yeah.
okay. I think I agree that the choice to not use kinetic, if that's the word, kinetic attack was an ethical choice. I think sparing innocent lives is always an important consideration. And
I think you can just look at what they did and what we did to respond. I mean, it was like, first off, they're trying to blow up ships, and our response
civilian
was
ships
to basically just shut down their systems for a certain amount of time.
to spare civilians.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think, Matt?
Well, I agree. I mean, it's almost irrelevant, though, in my opinion, because, like, if you ask Americans, they'll say the U.S. acted ethically, and if you ask Iranians, they'll say that, well, why was your drone near our airspace?
Yeah.
Like, why... We didn't put our country near your drone. You put your drone near our country. And the real risk with this kind of stuff, you can get into, like, people can justify whatever they want, but things can escalate, and it can get out of control very quickly. So I do agree that they acted ethically. Although I will say that, a kinetic attack versus a database-based attack, like, it's not always so cut and dry as to which one is which, almost. Like, the other Iranian or U.S. offensive cyber weapon against Iran was Stuxnet, where they damaged physical infrastructure using cyber attacks. So these two things can mix.
Well, I think we should say that it wasn't really like we didn't take out any roads or anything. I mean, it was like we took out equipment used to make bombs.
Well, I'm just speaking more in general.
Yeah.
You're
I just wanted to
military
clarify.
target.
Exactly.
I also wondered, though, like, in destroying a database, what the repercussions would be on civilians by, ruining some kind of database infrastructure.
Yeah. In this instance, it sounds like it was really militarily focused, which I think is good because then that limits damage to civilians.
Yeah.
But that really leads me to my next more data science-centered question where, as data scientists, how should we incorporate the idea that potential databases we're working with can like easily be breached, and we should especially consider this if we're working with sensitive data or government data? What do we think? Like, how do we incorporate that thought?
I think security has to be a priority then. It can't be a second thought.
Yeah.
The storage of our data is really, really important.
I mean, maybe if you don't need sensitive things to be a part of the online cloud database, then take it out before it even makes it to there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just proper security.
Yeah.
And be careful what you put in databases, period, I guess.
Yeah, so anyway, I think that's important for all of us to consider as we probably are going to go work with something sensitive at some point in our time, which leads me to my next point. In a capstone project that I did in like one of my undergraduate courses, we worked with a client who provided us data. It was very similar to the UVA capstone. Provided us data, and this data came with a lot of PII, so personally identifiable information, like social security's dates of birth, all these kinds of things that could be really detrimental if it got in the wrong hands. I was just doing it as a project, and I didn't even really realize at the time that it was bad to have this information. But as I was presenting my work on this database and it had all this information on these different people, I never used it as predictor variables, so I thought it was fine. But then as I was going about presenting, people were asking, hey, can I see your data set so that I can maybe try to replicate the analysis that you did? And I realized, I probably shouldn't be giving this data to just Joe Schmo who asked for it. So I removed the personal information and I replaced it with just like an arbitrary but unique identifier so that you could still see differences in individuals. Which was just interesting. I didn't think of it at first that, me having this data and maybe looking up somebody's social is unethical even though I'm not doing anything with it, but is it? I don't know. So then when I got rid of it, it was kind of a transition point for me to thinking about like how to safely keep track of my data, because if that data had gotten in the hands of Iran in this instance, they could have targeted the entire community that I had data on. And I don't know what I'm doing with my data at that point. So it was just kind of an eye-opening moment for me. And it really leads to the point of like data privacy and security, and it solidifies that even more. And it also speaks directly to like we can't have ignorant people in these areas working or disseminating like important databases. In this case, I was very ignorant on what was ethical, and the people who gave me the data were also ignorant. And it was just because like we were newbies in the field. And so it's just a prime risk for cyber offensive operations from other countries on us. And so I think it's a scary story that's like worth noting. Thank goodness nothing happened from it. But prior to our ethics class, if you were in this similar situation, what do you think you would have done with the data that I received?
I don't think for me, like, I wouldn't have given it to anybody outside of the Air Force, but like if somebody who I think would have been like approved just like me to get the data, I might have just given it to them, honestly.
Yeah.
Because if just like your supervisor is okay with giving it to you, then sometimes it's pretty hard to then think, well, they did something wrong. Like, to be like, well, they made a mistake. Like, you would almost just assume that, especially in the Air Force where you have like a rank system, that you're going to be like, well, like if they give it to me, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a civilian on the outside looking in, I hear the word security clearance and kind of implicitly trust that, although I'm on the outside. So maybe that's not as... Maybe my understanding of that is a little bit, colored by the fact that I don't have a security clearance and I don't understand exactly how that works. But I'm in a similar place to Connor, I think.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts?
I mean, I would have done what you did, which is replace the PII with some other identifier. But also, it's just like, when sharing that information, you need to establish that that person has a need to know, even if they have the proper clearance or even if they're higher ranking than you, which can sometimes be an awkward conversation to have.
Yeah.
But if somebody doesn't have a need to have that information, they don't get that information, period.
That's
and that goes for, anything from PII, like unclassified PII, all the way up to top secret stuff, even if they have the proper clearance.
I think it's important to say at this point that none of my views represent the views of the Air Force. Just going to put that out there. But last question, how do we balance this ease of data sharing with this simultaneous need for privacy, especially in government systems?
Well, right now, I think they're more on the data privacy, or I would say they're more on the difficulty of sharing data. Like the Pentagon in general has a massive overclassification tendency, and it makes it very difficult to share information between systems, which, like, there is a trade-off. So I don't really know like what you do other than update technology so that when you can share and it's appropriate to share, it's easier.
It's easy. Yeah, that's a good point.
None of my views represent the views of the United States Air Force.
All right, well, I think that's it.
Great. Thanks, Eve.
All right.
Thank you. Up next, we have data scientist Rachel Grace Tree.
Thank you. So I will be discussing my capstone project for the Masters of Data Science here at UVA. And I will be talking through sort of the description of the capstone, and then I'll explain a couple of ethical situations that have come up. So our client for the project is One Shared Story. It's a nonprofit organization that compiles and digitizes historical records for the purpose of better understanding the history of Virginia. And in particular, OSS seeks to amplify the records of historically underrepresented communities. So that's especially people of color and women. And so our capstone project within their larger, broader goal is to create a searchable relational database, which will be a storage place for historical records of various types. So that could be tax records, property records, letters, other documents, and pretty much we wanted to be able to adapt to different kinds of new historical documents that might come up and be relevant. So the relationships within the database will give a user the ability to query the database with a family name, for example, and and see any records that are related to that name. So any individuals that were recorded as in some kind of relationship with the name, any locations relevant to the name, or any events involving the name. We want it to pull up everything. And this capstone particularly interacts with the history of enslaved laborers in Virginia. So historically, records of formerly enslaved individuals are difficult to track because, for reasons I'll explain in a second. And that means that for the descendants, researching their family history is really difficult. Enslaved laborers were emancipated after the end of the Civil War, which was in 1865, and then obtained the right to be a citizen from the 14th Amendment to the Constitution in 1868. But this period of time in between the Civil War and 1868, about an 8-year period, is actually very difficult to understand historically because people who were once recorded as property began to be recorded as citizens. And that gap in the cohesive record makes it nearly impossible to connect a freed person with a previous record as an enslaved person.
Can I ask a question about
Sure.
that? Matt, do you think that's an example of data genocide?
Yes, actually, I would say, considering people as property would be
Absolutely.
an example of data genocide.
And a huge gap in the record for an
The gap in
entire
the record,
group
I
of
think,
people.
is data genocide.
Oh, that's what you mean.
Yeah.
A vulnerable group.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
data. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good point, Connor.
Yeah, thank you for
Thank
bringing that up. And so Virginia, in particular, is a unique place because after the Civil War, former enslaved laborers often worked their first paid jobs on the same plantations where they'd been enslaved, which means that often historical records from the same locations can provide the links between their status as citizens and their status as property. And so a plantation's tax records listing people as property might 10 years later list employees with the same names. So that's what we're trying to be a part of in our capstone project, is bringing more equitable access to people whose ancestors were enslaved laborers in Virginia. Because we're dealing with the historical data of a vulnerable population, this comes with a lot of ethical risks and considerations, and we need to be well versed in the societal impact of our work. So there's 2 ethical challenges that I've pinpointed. One centers around data ownership. So we've discussed with our client the need for a pipeline that will allow historical societies in Virginia to share data with One Shared Story without giving up the rights to the data. Our sponsor, Robin, has spoken to the tendency in humanities fields to view data as almost a bargaining chip because data ownership means an organization gets a seat at the table and gets some say in what kind of conclusions are made and what's done with the data. But if data isn't shared, more generalizable conclusions can't be made. And for the people who will be accessing the database, less data means it's more difficult to locate their ancestors.
Which that in itself is kind of data genocide too.
Yeah.
Keeping somebody's ancestry from them.
Yeah, but of course these historical societies do want to help, but it's that issue of this is our data, and if we give this to you, do we lose all power in this situation? So first of all, that means we need to be responsible with whatever data goes into this database. We need to store it very securely. But we also need to be transparent about what we're doing with the data so that the owners of the data can understand what's going on. I have a couple different ideas about what that could mean and how to kind of create that compromise between ownership and sharing. But, if the owners have certain wishes about how the data is provided, we have to honor those wishes. And so our database has to accommodate that as well. So I think, based on where we stand right now, the Capstone Group, we're hoping to approach the problem in a flexible way, listen to what our client wants and her understanding of these humanities societies who view their data as their property. And we'll have to learn more about how to navigate digital data ownership. But, for example, maybe someone might not be comfortable with the image of their physical document from the 1860s presented in this free database. But they are okay with, the names on that document in the database. So my question then coming off of this is, in a world where open source data is key to advancement, we need to balance that with the importance of ownership of data. Obviously, this can get into the question of personal privacy, but when it comes to historical data, what do you guys think? How could we balance that ownership of physical documents with the sharing of data that's so crucial?
Well, I guess once you give up the data, it's not like data is a physical thing. We're talking about physical documents, but there's information, there's data encoded on those physical documents.
Yeah.
Once you allow that out there, it's out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't necessarily know if you can make a claim to it after you've given it up in that way.
Yeah.
This is not just a problem with this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like, people everywhere, all kinds of organizations don't want to share data with each other. Even organizations you would think are working together for the same thing, kind of like this.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's, I don't know. You guys have any input to add?
It brings to my mind, and this would not solve the problem, but I'm not sure if there's a good way of like citing databases that you use, which kind of gives credit back to the owner of the database. I like your idea of not including the actual document. I think that's probably a good first step. But maybe another first step is just developing a good way of citing databases that really make it clear who owns the data.
I think you're just going to have to individually negotiate with all these different people who have these documents and just figure out what do they want and how can we make it happen almost, because it is very important to get their information to complete your database.
Yeah. Well, I even wonder if someone were to export the results of their search, how we could cite the sources of the data that they're exporting. Or, if a society is like a church that had records of churchgoers at a certain point in time would be comfortable with like the image of their document watermarked, given out to the public.
Yeah.
Like I wonder what the compromise is there.
It's almost like you need to figure out if you were an individual going to that church to look at the document, like what are they going to give you? Like, so how can we replicate that on your database?
Yeah. And then also, but it's so complicated because people who have no connection to the church will also be using the database.
Right.
So yeah, there's not a great answer at the moment, but yeah, I think it's going to be a kind of an issue of figuring out what the different owners want. So the second dilemma that I've noticed in our capstone is an issue of data presentation and the ethics of that. So another key spec for the project has to do with the vocabulary used in discussing the history of enslaved people in the United States. So in previous years, the words owner and master were used by a historian to reference a person's enslaver, but that's no longer a commonly used term because those words are seen as empowering the enslaver and dehumanizing the enslaved person. It's seen as reducing the enslaved person to a commodity instead of viewing them as someone who had slavery forced upon them. So this informs a need for our project's dashboard, which will have fields where someone using the database can enter words to be adaptable to this kind of vocabulary. So we are planning at this point to have this dashboard have a menu where you can search for names that have a certain type of relationship to another name. So for example, you may be searching for the surname Jones, who was enslaved by someone with the name John Smith. To do this, you would enter the name Jones in our main search bar, but then enter the name John Smith under a label of relationship enslaver. A key concern for our client when shared storing is that the terminology used to describe these relationships may change again in the future. And these labels need to be changeable without changing the structure of the database because we need non-technical people to be able to go in and update. So this is important for an ethical presentation of the data. Our client's concern is that if data is presented in a way that uses insensitive and oppressive terminology, then the data might be inaccessible to the users that they're trying to reach. So in our response, the best thing we can do is be creating a dashboard that will be easily changed, just the labels, not the underlying structure. So we'll need to come up with some sort of system where users can interface without having to code, so the client can do it herself and change names if needed of different fields. And my question for you all is, if our data, the database itself, as far as we can control, will not be designed with bias in mind, or any kind of discriminatory practice. But if our data is perceived as biased or oppressive in the way it's presented, how do we respond? How do we explain that to people?
You have to use some, this word's not great in this context, but like discrimination. Is that perception warranted? Do you actually need to change something? Is like the juice of changing it worth the squeeze of the effort of changing it? Because somebody can always perceive something some way. But if you're going to, restructure your entire database every time somebody has an issue with anything in it, you're going to be always restructuring your database. You're going to be spending more time on that than anything else. So, this is perhaps like an unpopular view, but you do need to use some judgment as to whether, somebody's perception of your data as insensitive or offensive warrants changing it, warrants putting in that effort.
You're right. And I think this is where the need for like a data science almost auditing company kind of comes into play, because you can't care about every single person's opinion, like quite frankly. So it's almost like there should be these established centers, almost like consulting centers, where you can where you can like submit, hey, we've gotten complaints about this database. Will you investigate it and see if there's bias inherent in here, or if it is like unethical because of X, Y, and Z reasons? That'd almost be really valuable, and I don't think we're there yet, but I think that is an important way for data science to progress in the future.
I like that a lot, because you can also have specialists too. They know exactly what they're doing. You send them all of your emails, all your complaints, and they can go in and take a look at what those people are saying.
Yeah, like a technical ethical specialist.
Yeah, no, I like that.
I feel like they exist, but they're not as near as prevalent as they should be right now.
They probably wouldn't have that title either.
Yeah.
I like the title. It's good.
Yeah, but I like that idea. I like that because it kind of bridges the cultural sensitivity that's needed, and actually applying it in a technical capacity. And also, someone who'd be able to go in and understand, okay, the relationships in this database are not biased in any way. It's just the current presentation is offensive to this population, which means if we change the presentation, it will now be accessible to the users that we're hoping to reach. So I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Well, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now we've got Matt Manor, data scientist.
Hello, I'm Matt Manor. Today, the article or the scenario I want to talk about is a Forbes article from more than 3 years ago, and it's about new WhatsApp and Facebook encryption backdoors, which refers to a new policy that WhatsApp and Facebook and other similar social media platforms will be forced to disclose encrypted messages to law enforcement agencies. This is, I think, a very salient topic right now, the topic of free speech and what should be allowed. This actually even goes a little bit farther than that, though. This talks about private messages between parties. And I think this is very relevant to data science and myself personally, not because I've ever engaged in any activity that would warrant law enforcement attention.
Are you sure?
I am pretty sure of that, yeah.
Okay.
But this is just a question that interests me very much. And also, as somebody going to work and who has worked with the military, kind of the global law enforcement agency, I'm interested in this, and what's the line or what's the balancing act between, safety and stopping terrorists or pedophiles or whatnot, and people's right to privacy. So I'm just interested to hear general opening thoughts. What do you guys think? Would this be something, if you were, say, an employee at WhatsApp or Facebook, how would you feel about something that allows law enforcement to read private messages between parties?
I think I'd feel like I'd want a different job.
So, but say, it made me feel like, back to the FanDuel, like if you're the one writing the algorithms to draw more people into addictive practices, it's kind of a similar situation where maybe it's not, it's not exactly the same, but you're in the same situation where you probably wouldn't like what you're doing.
Yeah.
But there's another hand here where that could be incredibly beneficial to a user of WhatsApp. So let's just say you're convicted of a crime, you're being investigated, you're on trial maybe for a murder, something horrible, your life's going to be ruined, but you literally did not do it. And there's messages and certain things on these apps that could...
Like an alibi.
Yeah, that could corroborate whatever you're trying to argue for yourself. Then that's really valuable. I guess maybe I don't understand it very well, Matt. Was this possible beforehand with consent, and now it's possible without consent?
What do you mean?
If you're a user, in Eve's example, if I'm on trial, I could still give my phone to law enforcement and have them be able to look at the same thing, right? But then this would be allowing them to do it without my consent, without me giving them my phone.
This would essentially allow, let's say the FBI or the, whatever it's called in Britain, the G something.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess the question is, though, could they do that if I gave them permission to already?
Of course. If you give them permission to your personal...
I take it back. My argument's obsolete.
So as of now, normally when you're doing discovery at trial or something, they search your phone. and they have to, if you've deleted your text, like they have to get a warrant to search your phone.
Right.
Okay.
Sure. And if you've deleted your text or something, they have to get a warrant to like subpoena the communications company. This is different. This is like, encrypted messages that they can just
You can just
access.
take.
Yeah, no.
All
I
the
don't
time.
like
Yeah,
that at
okay.
all.
Yeah, I'm not a fan.
No.
I would leave. I would
Mhm.
work somewhere else. In answer to your question.
So then here's the other question is, would you, like, are you just working somewhere else and quitting that job because you don't like it or because you feel like that'll do something? Because think about it this way. What if the next person who comes in is happily going to build that?
And they probably will.
Right.
Yeah.
So what do you get by quitting your job? I'm not trying to like play devil's advocate.
No, I know.
I'm
So
trying
then
to
you're almost
tease
just
out,
saying you
like,
need to figure out what you can do about
Yeah.
it. But the problem is then you
like, can you do anything?
we get to like whistleblower status where you're like,
Well, I feel like part of the reason for me leaving the company, that's what, if I were in the situation that I left, is honestly because I think for me mentally to know that I was a part of something that I didn't agree with, that's a good enough reason to leave. I know that doesn't mean it will stop.
But you just don't want to be a part of it yourself.
That's the base reason for me leaving. Whether or not I would whistleblow gets into more complicated questions.
Yeah, it's almost like if you were going to whistleblow on this, I mean, I guess it's published, so is it really even whistleblowing at that point? But if you're going to take this somewhere, you almost have to take it to Congress and then outlaw this kind of behavior, and then that is not an easy thing to do. So,
Well,
yeah, you'd have to get a law saying that the FBI and other
yeah.
enforcement agencies don't have authority to read
Yeah,
these
to
messages.
do that.
Yes.
Some kind of
to reverse
activist group.
whatever rule, and then that leads you to how the tech industry is always one step ahead of lawmakers.
Mhm.
So they now institute whatever law we've proposed, and what happens next? Another probably bad thing that like Congress needs to review, and it's going to take years. So it just is a tough situation. I don't know if there's a good answer.
Yeah. So interesting to note is that this was from 2019, and tech companies, including Facebook, were very opposed to this measure. They wanted to protect privacy on their platform. Whether,
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Whether that would be the case today, I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you think? I won't ask this. I'll move on to the next article, but just maybe something to think about and chew on is: do you think the state of discourse and privacy rights and free speech has gotten better or worse with regards to these tech companies since that time? Something just to think about. But now I'm going to move on to a question that's even more salient and personal to my heart, because I lost some money with this company, and it's probably the biggest story in tech right now. The FTX collapse. So I won't, talk about background to this other than that FTX was basically stealing their customers' funds and making risky bets and then lost a lot of it. And but the main character at the center of this is this guy named Sam Bankman-Fried, or called SBF. And his philosophy centers around effective altruism. So his idea was basically get as rich as you can, and use that money for good, what he defines as good. And I'm interested in hearing what you guys think, because clearly this man breached ethics in an egregious way, one that should land him behind bars for years or longer. He stole billions of dollars, including from retail investors. He didn't steal from Goldman Sachs or whatever. This was from average people like my poor self. So the question is, some of the stuff that he wanted to do with that money that he made, because he was worth like $30 billion like a month ago. Some of that stuff we've talked about in this ethics class as being good things, stopping climate change, promoting equality of, whatever nebulous kind, sometimes ill-defined. But he gave away a lot of money. So do you think that the ends justify the means in this? He broke the law. Clearly, it's easy now to say that he's a criminal and should be locked up, but even now he's getting pretty glowing media reports. There's a lot of puff pieces written about him. I think yesterday he gave a speech at some New York Times conference. So clearly there's mixed feelings about this guy. Do you guys think Like, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, I guess I have a question. Is the idea, are some of these glowing reports because effectively he took from the rich and gave to the poor?
No, he didn't give to anyone. He gave to these charities.
Donations.
Yeah, so he didn't, I would say he didn't really take from the rich per se. He took from everyone.
Like yourself.
Like
right.
myself. And then I guess that's another question. Like, even if he did take from, rich investors.
Well, the people who really lost out would have been the ones who invested more.
You mean, because they lost more money.
Yeah.
From what I understand, how it happened was he basically took all the money that was invested in the stock market in his company. He then took that money and bought more of his own stock, so that drove the price up.
Mm.
And then when people wanted to sell the stock, they didn't have money to fund those sales.
Yeah. So whatever he did, we'll just say he broke the law. It's not something
which is obviously very illegal. Like, you can't invest in yourself in the stock market.
Yeah.
He broke the law, and he committed an ethical violation. Say he stole, billions of dollars, and a lot of it came from retail investors. Personally, even if he stole from richer people, is that still stealing on the same scale? Is that still unethical? What do you guys think?
I'm going to jump in and say that cryptocurrency in general is not very transparent with how it operates, especially to an average citizen who's trying to invest in something. I feel like there's a lot of people who are investing in crypto and don't really even know what it is or how it's generated, that kind of thing. And so the whole industry in that sense needs to do better on making it accessible and understandable to people. But in this instance, it sounds like even more of the issue is that SPF, what's his name?
SPF.
He really wasn't transparent with anybody because, you're saying, there's a massive sports stadium named after him or something.
Yeah, the
right?
FTX had bought the naming rights for the Heat arena.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then if he's doing glowing reports, giving a speech, what? Is he not in jail? He's not holding himself accountable? I don't know. What's the status there?
I agree. I think that's the biggest issue is the lack of accountability, even if he did do some good with his charitable donations.
Right. So
from a lot of people.
Yeah.
Let's ignore the man and maybe even the specific case for now. But if you have an opportunity as a data scientist to do something unethical, and yet you could use the products of that unethical behavior to do something that you perceive as very ethical.
Yeah, I don't think the ends justify the means.
I agree.
That's really the question.
You can't. Yeah, just because you're doing good, you can't do bad to do good.
No,
I agree.
Okay.
There you have
It seems to be a
SBF.
consensus. We don't like SBF here. But then, see, here's the thing. SBF is a very easy guy to hate right now.
Sure.
And, we'll wrap this up in about a minute. But it gets muddier. That's why, a lot of the ethical scenarios that we talk about in class are sometimes a little too simplistic for my liking. What if the scenario is, we talk about Theranos, for example. What if the scenario is you are a data scientist working for a company that is making a product that you truly believe will cure cancer, and you truly believe that all you need is a little bit more runway, but you're having trouble getting funding, and you need to, I don't know, falsify some data or something, but that this company will make this product that will enhance people's lives and save them from some disease. That's a more realistic scenario.
I think that's a harder question to answer because if you're not harming anybody with the bad you're doing, that's different, because the bad in the other case is literally stealing from people.
Yeah.
And you're hurting millions of people. But if you're falsifying data, and the worst that you could do is, you're maybe the person you're hurting is the venture capitalist who invested, but you think that it's going to pay off for them. So it's that's where it's weird.
Health stuff is tough. It's a tough space because it's people's lives at stake, and it's cancer would be a huge breakthrough. I think honestly not that I know exactly all the intricacies of this, but I wonder if it's even a question of all right, if you run out of money and you've got some proprietary, drug that you're developing, but you're not quite finished with it, which do you care about more? Keeping that drug for yourself and making the money off of it when it works, if you believe in it that much, or at the end of the day, if you can't get the money and you'd have to lie, taking it to a big company that would develop it all the way. Not that that's a happy place to be if you're the one who had this, who did the development, who did the work, who invested, and who has investors. But if your main concern there is actually saving lives, I think I don't think lying is actually the way to go. I think there are other ways. They're not fun. They're not profitable.
Yeah.
But there are other ways.
Like, give up the work you've done to somebody who can get the work done, because that's
save
what
all
is
these
good
lives.
for society.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'd have to
Yeah.
sell. You'd
I'm
sell
not
what you have
saying I
so
like
far to the
that.
company.
Like, if that were me and I was about to lose everything I owned because this is all I put my money into, would I be happy? Absolutely not.
Yeah.
But that's such a big, I mean, people's lives are at stake.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about Theranos a lot in class. I'm sure if you asked Elizabeth Holmes today, she'd say that they just needed a little bit more time to develop their technology, and they could have made a real difference.
Mm-hmm.
So something to think about for all y'all listeners out there. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
What's the name of this podcast?
God
God
God ethics.